During Operation Desert Shield, the coalition were looking for a way to trick the Iraqis as to where they were going to attack. The US military's basic idea for deception was to make it simple, believable, and not so costly that it diverts resources from the main effort. The coalition was concerned about keeping the war to as minimal a cost in their soldiers' lives as possible, but there was no guarantee that it would happen. The Iraqi army, as the media constantly reminded everyone, was the fourth largest in the world, with years of combat experience fighting Iran, and they might even use chemical and biological weapons. The US actually feared that they might suffer 20,000 casualties, and in August of 1990, there were fears that Saddam might push his army forwards and invade Saudi Arabia before the US could arrive in strength. For this reason, General Schwarzkopf wanted the news media to film his troops arriving off the plains, so that the constant rerunning of the clips would make it appear to the Iraqis that there were far more Americans than there actually were. But the real challenge would be actually doing what the coalition was set up to do: force Iraq out of Kuwait, which was where the vast majority of Iraqi soldiers were, and would be, stationed. The Iraqis themselves were pretty convinced that the coalition would advance into Kuwait from the land and the sea, and so the coalition wanted to keep them convinced that that's exactly what was going to happen, while they were actually getting ready to attack somewhere else. Specifically, the coalition wanted to keep the Iraqis focused on the area of Wadi al-Batin as where the land invasion would take place. For the plan to work, the coalition only had one person to convince: Saddam. Because his generals were not allowed to make their own decisions, it didn't necessarily matter if they worked anything out, because the coalition knew Saddam wouldn't listen if he were convinced of his own idea. The basic plan was to deploy the coalition in front of Kuwait to make it look as though they would attack there, and then, under the cover of the air campaign, move loads of troops to the west undetected so that they could attack into Iraq, where the number of enemy divisions were fewer. A month into the air campaign in mid-February, the troops started to move west. To keep the Iraqis from realising what was going on at the front lines, small attacks and raids would be launched in order to make it appear as though the coalition were conducting reconnaissance into the Wadi al-Batin before they advanced through it. One of those units involved would be the American 1st Battalion of the 5th Cavalry Regiment, which was to be known as Task Force 15. According to an American officer in the task force, the average age of the soldiers in his platoon, part of A Company, known as the Grim Reapers, was 19. The group consisted of 2 tank companies and 2 armoured personnel carrier companies, as well as having some supporting vehicles. The deception attacks started on February 15, 1991, and US troops skirmished with the Iraqis for several days. On the 19th, it was Task Force 15's turn to move into Iraq. Firstly, A Company would move to an area called Phase Line Germany, and then, the next day, the rest of the battalion would join them and they would advance to an area called Phase Line Sicily. In the evening of February 19th, A Company drove into the night, with Iraqi anti-aircraft guns firing in the distance as the coalition continued the air campaign. After 5 hours, the company spotted some Iraqis in the distance around an observation tower and called artillery on them, which led to the Iraqis sending their own artillery barrage, which missed completely. It was still quite light when they'd left, but now it was pitch black and raining so much that nobody could see more than 10 feet in front of them. Not even the night vision goggles were working because there was no moonlight. A platoon commander said they could have really gotten lost if they didn't have GPS to guide them where they needed to go. They then settled in for the night and waited for the rest of their battalion. They were about 2 miles into Iraq. The following day, the whole battalion moved onwards with the order to carry out their mission and the instruction of "Do not become decisively engaged and attrit your force." Attrit was US military speak for destroy. The march was very quiet, with the vehicles passing by empty Iraqi trenches. At one point was a small skirmish between some Iraqi soldiers and an American armoured personnel carrier, and 7 Iraqis were taken prisoner when Task Force 15 scouts overran a bunker complex. While they were looking for more prisoners and checking the bunkers, the Americans came under a hail of Iraqi fire. As the main body of the task force moved to fight back, they came under even more fire. The Americans had run into a trap. The Iraqis had an entire ridgeline covered with artillery, mortars, and an entrenched infantry battalion, and even some tanks. All of them had their guns pointed at Task Force 1-5. Soon enough, an anti-aircraft vehicle was blown up by the Iraqi guns, while an armoured personnel carrier was hit by a shell about 10 minutes later. Platoon leader Alan Dover described the carrier being hit. I looked to my right and heard a violent crack. A black and orange flash followed by bits of metal flying off the vehicle. It began to smoke, and soldiers appeared to wallow around the vehicle, collapsing. Another carrier went in to help the survivors, and that one was hit too. The shell hit the vehicle's missile launcher, which sent the 2 missiles in it hurtling off into the distance. Private First Class Cooper, who was giving first aid to another soldier directly next to the vehicle, was hit in the legs by shrapnel from the explosion and died later from blood loss. For saving the life of the wounded soldier, he was given a posthumous Silver Star. Not long afterwards, the Americans began calling for help. US planes began to strafe the Iraqis as Task Force 1-5 began to withdraw. With multiple vehicles out of action, an armoured bulldozer's track broke and became immovable. It was well over an hour after being ambushed that the Americans managed to get away from the Iraqi guns. On the way out, an American tank was driven over a mine and its track was damaged. I've not been able to find a single Iraqi account of the battle, so there is no way to know what it was like for them. The Americans claim to have destroyed up to 20 Iraqi artillery pieces, between 2 and 5 tanks, and a whole battalion of Iraqi infantry. But there is no way for me to say whether or not that's true, and sources differ anyway. We do know, though, that the Americans had 4 vehicles damaged or totally destroyed, 9 men wounded, and 3 men dead. The deception attacks would continue until the ground war began 4 days later.